Imagine bringing a new life into the world. Without doctors, without hospitals, and without pain relief, just faith, folklore, and a midwife who might also be the village gossip. In the Middle Ages, childbirth wasn't just painful, it was dangerous, terrifying, and surrounded by rituals that feel more like superstition than medicine. But how did medieval women survive it? And what shocking customs surrounded the act of giving birth? Let's find out. In medieval Europe, pregnancy wasn't private. It was practically public property. Forget pregnancy tests. Instead, women were told to urinate in a clay pot while a healer checked the bubbles, the color, or even dropped a needle inside to see if it rusted. If it did, congratulations, you were either pregnant or haunted. Food taboos were endless. No eels, they'd make the baby slippery. No cabbage, it caused sinful flatulence. And absolutely no rabbit meat unless you wanted a child with wild eyes. Instead, women were encouraged to eat white bread, apples, and whatever the goats didn't finish. But it wasn't just diet. Everything in daily life was thought to mark the unborn child. Look at the moon, risk a cursed baby, step over a dog, invite misfortune, laugh during a storm. Terrible idea. For medieval women, every action felt like a gamble. But superstition was just the beginning, because once pregnancy advanced, things got even stranger. No yoga classes, no vitamins, instead herbs, charms, and stern midwives. Women were advised to stay warm, but not too warm. Move, but not too much. In other words, do nothing wrong, ever. Herbal teas included mugwort, rue, and fennel. The problem? Side effects like fainting, nausea, and visions of Saint Margaret telling you to lie down. Meanwhile, family members tied charms around a woman's bed, hung wolf fur in the rafters, and sometimes handed her a walnut carved with the Lord's Prayer. Half medicine, half magic, and entirely terrifying. But no matter how many charms you carried, nothing could prepare you for the ordeal waiting at the end. When labor began, women were shut into a darkened room with herbs hanging from the rafters and candles flickering dimly. No men allowed. The birthing chamber was strictly women's territory. At the center was the infamous birthing stool, a wooden chair with a hole cut in it. Comfort wasn't the goal. Gravity was. The midwife, usually a tough, battle-hardened woman, took command. She arrived with a crucifix, herbs, a knife, and enough authority to silence even the mother-in-law. Surrounded by women chanting prayers, sprinkling holy water, and occasionally rubbing goose fat on the mother's legs, childbirth became a mix of medicine, magic, and madness. But the real challenge wasn't just the ritual, it was the pain. Forget epidurals. Forget anesthesia. In the Middle Ages, pain was considered a divine punishment, a reminder of Eve's sin. Screaming was allowed, but only if it sounded holy. Too much noise? Risk attracting demons. For relief, women were given herbal brews, relics, or leather to bite down on. Sometimes, midwives simply yelled encouragement like, "Push or I'll curse you myself." And while the mother fought through agony, one figure held the power of life and death in her hands. The midwife was more than a birth assistant, she was commander-in-chief. Armed with herbs, holy water, and a poker face that never cracked, she delivered more babies than most priests had copied psalms. But her role was risky. Too much success. People whispered, witch. Too many deaths. People whispered, curse. She walked a razor's edge, respected and feared at the same time. And once the baby finally arrived, the struggles were far from over. If the baby cried, it was a miracle. If not, panic. Unbaptized infants were believed to be trapped in limbo. So midwives performed emergency baptisms, sometimes with holy water, sometimes with wine, and in desperate cases, spit. If the baby lived, joy spread through the household. If not, grief was buried quickly, both literally and emotionally. But even survival at birth didn't guarantee safety. For medieval mothers, the dangers continued long after delivery. There was no recovery period, no medical care, no casseroles from neighbors. The moment a baby was born, the mother was expected to get back to work bleeding, feverish or not. Postpartum depression, labeled as demons. Infection, just God's will. 40 days later, mothers had to go through a ritual called churching, a purification ceremony, because childbirth made them unclean. And yet, despite all the pain and risk, women kept having children because in the medieval world, motherhood wasn't just a role, it was survival. Medieval childbirth wasn't just a medical event, it was a gamble with life and death, wrapped in superstition, faith, and sheer resilience. Every cry of a newborn was a victory. Every mother who survived was a warrior. And for all the strange rituals and brutal dangers, one truth remained. Birth in the Middle Ages was nothing short of a miracle, every single time. Imagine working 12-hour shifts in a factory, choking on coal smoke, and never seeing clean air until one invention suddenly gives you freedom. Not the telephone, not electricity, but trains. Because in Victorian Britain, the railway didn't just move coal and steel, it moved people. And in doing so, it gave birth to something we still love today, the seaside holiday. But how did crowded industrial workers turn sleepy fishing villages into booming resorts? And why were donkeys and bathing machines the hottest attractions of the 19th century? Let's dive in. Before trains, the seaside was only for the rich. Aristocrats took horse-drawn carriages to towns like Brighton, convinced sea air cured everything from gout to melancholy. But when the railway spread, ordinary workers suddenly had access to the coast. For the price of a week's wages, families could escape smog-choked cities and spend a day watching waves crash against the horizon. And those towns? They transformed almost overnight. Brighton became the glamorous jewel of seaside culture, thanks to the eccentric Prince Regent and his onion-domed royal pavilion. But Blackpool, that was the people's paradise. Once a quiet fishing village, it exploded into life with piers, dance halls, and the iconic Blackpool Tower, a working-class Eiffel Tower with more donkey rides than Paris could ever dream of. But seaside fun wasn't just about buildings, it was about bizarre new traditions. Victorians loved the sea but hated the idea of showing skin. The solution? Bathing machines, wooden huts on wheels that were dragged into the water by horses. Women stepped inside, changed into bathing dresses that looked more like curtains than swimwear, and slipped into the waves without scandal. Meanwhile, attendants called dippers often shoved bathers straight into the icy surf because Victorians believed shock therapy cured everything. But if bathing machines were about modesty, the food was about pure indulgence. The beach quickly became a carnival of cheap thrills. Vendors sold oysters, sticks of rock candy, and Penny Lick's tiny glasses of ice cream meant to be licked clean and returned. Hygienic? Not at all. Popular? Absolutely. And for children, nothing beat donkey rides along the sand. Imagine being a factory kid seeing the ocean for the first time, then climbing onto a grumpy donkey while your parents snapped a photograph. It was the highlight of countless Victorian childhoods. But the real heart of seaside life wasn't the beach, it was the pier. Victorian entrepreneurs built giant wooden piers stretching into the sea, not for ships, but for entertainment. They were packed with arcades, tea rooms, brass bands, and variety shows. Walking the pier wasn't just about fresh air, it was about being seen. Men and women in their best clothes promenaded like it was one giant catwalk. For working families, a penny bought music, laughter, or sticky toffee. For the wealthy, it was a chance to flaunt refinement. The pier became Britain's first true playground for all classes. And yet, while Victorians embraced fun, they never stopped insisting it was good for you. Doctors still claimed that salt water was medicine. Parents dunked children into the waves, convinced it would strengthen their constitution. The screams may not have sounded healthy, but in Victorian minds, every icy plunge was therapy. At the same time, moral critics worried that fun itself was dangerous. They warned that sweets, songs, and seaside flirtations could lead society astray. But for workers escaping industrial misery, these warnings didn't matter. On the beach, life finally felt free. And perhaps the strangest part? At the seaside, Britain's strict class system began to blur. In cities, rich and poor rarely mingled. At the beach, they rode the same donkeys, walked the same piers, and bought the same ice cream. Middle-class families complained about rowdy workers singing too loudly, while aristocrats tried to keep their distance. But the sea didn't care about social rank. For a brief holiday week, Britain became just a little more equal. For kids raised in cramped, dirty factory towns, the beach was a revelation. They built sandcastles, ran barefoot, and laughed through Punch and Judy puppet shows. Donkey rides became postcards. Ice cream became memory. For the first time, childhood wasn't just survival, it was joy. And by the end of Queen Victoria's reign, the seaside wasn't just entertainment. It was a revolution. The Victorian seaside holiday changed Britain forever. It proved that leisure wasn't laziness, it was life. It taught workers that joy could be bought for a penny. It blurred class lines, created childhood memories, and gave birth to traditions we still carry today. So next time you hear seagulls and waves, remember, the seaside isn't just a vacation. It's a Victorian invention and one that shaped how the world learned to have fun. For the Apache, health wasn't just about the body. It was about balance with the land, the spirits, and the community. If you fell sick, it wasn't just a fever. It meant something deeper was broken, maybe a wrong step in life, a quarrel in the family, or even angering the spirit world. And to restore that balance, the Apache turned to medicine men, ceremonies, and remedies so powerful they blended science with the supernatural. But what exactly did they believe? And how did chants, sand paintings, and sacred herbs heal not just the body, but the soul? Unlike Western medicine, which treats symptoms, the Apache believed every illness had both a visible cause and an invisible one. If a hunter disrespected the animal he killed, weakness might follow. If a family argued endlessly, sickness could creep into the home. Even dreams were warnings that your spirit had drifted out of harmony. To heal the body, you had to heal the balance of life itself. And the guardians of this balance were no ordinary healers. The Apache medicine man wasn't just a doctor. He was priest, counselor, and protector all in one. His training took years, memorizing chants, learning herbs, and mastering ceremonies where even a single mistake could invite danger. Some were chosen by visions. Others survived near-death experiences and returned believed to carry spiritual gifts. Their role? To stand between the people and the unseen forces of illness. But their greatest tools weren't scalpels or potions, they were plants. The Apache saw every plant as alive with spirit, wisdom, and power. Sage cleansed and purified. Juniper berries soothed stomachs and drove away evil. Yucca became shampoo, soap, and medicine for wounds. But gathering herbs was never casual. They were collected at certain times of day under the right moon, with prayers whispered and cornmeal offered back to the earth. Healing wasn't just chemistry. It was a sacred exchange. And once the plants were prepared, their power was amplified through sound. For the Apache, words weren't just words. Spoken or sung with intent, they became medicine. Chants could last minutes or days mirroring the rhythms of sun, moon, and river. They weren't performed solo. Families and entire communities joined in, turning healing into a collective act of sound and spirit. To the Apache, chanting wasn't superstition. It was alignment. Words set the world right again. But sometimes words weren't enough. The Apache also painted their prayers into the earth itself. Using crushed stone, pollen, and clay, healers created intricate sand paintings, maps of the cosmos in miniature. Animals, mountains, and sacred symbols appeared, each calling on a force of healing. The sick were placed at the center of these images as if being drawn back into harmony with the universe. And when the ritual ended, the painting was destroyed, its power released, its impermanence reminding everyone that illness too could be swept away. And yet, the most powerful healing didn't happen in isolation, it happened in ceremony. Some rituals lasted days, weaving chants, herbs, and sand paintings into one unified performance. Everyone participated, family, neighbors, elders. Healing was never private. When one person was out of balance, the whole community gathered to set things right. One of the most famous was the night chant, invoking holy beings to cleanse sickness. Another was the sunrise dance, a ceremony of renewal for young women. To the Apache, these weren't just rituals. They were bridges between worlds. But none of this could exist without one key element, the land itself. The Apache saw mountains, rivers, and animals as living relatives. To harm them carelessly was to wound yourself. The eagle carried prayers skyward. The bear symbolized healing and endurance. Even insects were teachers of persistence and community. Healing often meant journeying into sacred places, mountain foothills, riverbanks, groves, where the very earth became medicine. Respect for nature wasn't optional. It was the foundation of health. And through this connection, the community itself became the greatest healer. Illness was never born alone. Families gathered, children watched and learned, neighbors brought food and prayers. To be healed was to be reminded that you were never isolated, you were part of a living circle. And when a patient recovered, gratitude flowed not just to the spirits, but to every hand and voice that stood by them. For the Apache, healing was never a quick fix. It was a journey back into harmony with self, with family, with nature, and with the unseen world. Herbs, chants, sand paintings, and ceremonies weren't just medicine. They were philosophy, identity, and survival. And even today, The Apache remind us of a truth modern life often forgets. Health isn't just the body, it's balance. Today, weddings are about love, vows, and happily ever after. But in the Middle Ages, marriage was rarely romantic. It was a contract, a transaction, where family alliances, land, and reputation mattered far more than the feelings of the bride and groom. So how did people marry when love was the last thing on the list? And what shocking rules governed medieval marriage? In the medieval world, marriage wasn't just two people joining lives. It was families joining forces. A nobleman might marry off his daughter to secure land. A peasant might seek marriage to stabilize property or labor rights. The church oversaw the union, but the real weight came from family negotiations. For many brides, their marriage was decided long before they had a say. And sometimes, the wedding itself barely resembled what we imagine today. Forget white dresses and diamond rings. In the early Middle Ages, a wedding could be as simple as exchanging vows outside the church door. No priest, no problem. As long as both parties said, "I take you as mine," the union was considered binding. But over time, the church tightened control, insisting on priests, witnesses, and public ceremonies. Why? Because marriage wasn't just spiritual, it was also a way to regulate society. But while the church preached purity, reality looked very different. Rules about who you could marry were strict. Cousins? Forbidden. Marrying without parental approval? Risky. And yet, scandals still happened. Secret unions, runaway lovers, even nobles breaking vows to chase new alliances. For peasants, love matches were more common, but for nobles, marrying for love was almost unthinkable. Your heart bowed to politics. And for women especially, the stakes were brutally high. For most medieval brides, marriage meant handing over control. A woman's dowry money, land, or livestock passed to her husband. Her duty? To bear children, manage the household, and remain obedient. Widows had more freedom. They could run estates or remarry as they chose. But young brides? Some were married off at just 12 or 13. Romance wasn't part of the deal. Survival was. And once the wedding vows were spoken, daily married life was anything but glamorous. In noble households, marriages were alliances of power. A wife might manage servants, estates, or castle defenses while her husband went to war. In peasant homes, the couple worked side by side in the fields, their marriage less about politics and more about survival. But across classes, one thing was constant: marriage wasn't private. The community watched, judged, and often interfered. And speaking of interference, the church had plenty to say about what happened behind closed doors. Medieval sermons gave couples strict guidelines. Intercourse was only for procreation, never pleasure. Certain days of the week, forbidden. Religious holidays, off limits. And if a couple broke these rules, they risked confession, penance, or worse, public shame. Yet, despite all the restrictions, desire found its way. Love stories like Tristan and Isolde or Lancelot and Guinevere showed just how much people longed for passion, even when society demanded duty. But here's the shocking truth: even in a world of rules and contracts, love sometimes won. Though rare, some medieval marriages were built on affection. Letters survive from couples who spoke tenderly of missing each other. Peasant marriages especially could carry genuine partnership, working together, raising children, and sharing life's struggles. Love wasn't outlawed, it was just secondary. And when it appeared, it was often remembered as extraordinary. Marriage in the Middle Ages was far from a fairy tale. It was duty, alliance, and survival, with love squeezed in wherever it could fit. For nobles, it was politics. For peasants, it was survival. For women, it was sacrifice. And yet, within all the rules and restrictions, humanity still shone through. Because even in the strictest times, people still longed for what we long for today: connection, affection, and love.